Tornike heads TBC research, TBC research branch of TBC Capital, which is investment bank of TBC Bank. And I think he has very interesting presentation about current status of Georgian wine business. And we all can learn a lot from some of the data and some of the charts he will be presenting to us. Tornike is a very well-educated person. He traveled the world for his education, including spent some time at Oxford University. And but most importantly, he's back to Georgia to contribute to Georgian wine, not only wine, but wine as well, awareness about Georgian wine and attractiveness of the wine business for investments. When I saw this presentation, first version of this presentation earlier this year, I realized how important it is to communicate this message to the broader audience that you can actually make money in the wine business, because not everyone is expecting to make money in wine business. So, Tornike, without further ado, please, floor is yours.
Thank you a lot for the introduction. My pleasure to present this presentation to you. Wine in the times of COVID. First things first, let us start with a brief overview of Georgian market and where the Georgia stands in terms of the wine worldwide. So we're a small-scale player, number 26 by the total area of vineyard, that of course, leading the grid are Spain, China, and France here. From the perspective of wine production, we are number 20th worldwide. Here also Italy, France, Spain, USA lead the grid. We are not in the top countries from the standpoint of the wine consumption. However, through our free trade agreements with European countries and other countries also, we have the direct access to the market with a size of 156 million hectoliters worldwide. So basically, our potential of export via those agreements is practically limitless for now. Turning to the perspectives of the global market came under serious pressure, the global trade of wine from the COVID. On the charts, we can see the top exporters of the wine and their dynamics throughout the year, and also top importers of the wine. As you can see, with the first surge of the pandemics, the export of top exporters went down by percentages ranging from 20 to 30 throughout the year, and then they started stabilizing little by little. As for the top importers of the country, the stabilization here is also visible for the last months. However, for instance, the China, which is number 4th largest importer of the wine, here the imports remain pretty much reduced by circa 30% from the last available data, as we can see. Moving to, however, in these times and given these circumstances, one point has to be added that Georgian export of the wine did not suffer this much. So it brings us to the point to believe that Georgian wine is a niche product, which the demand for which remains quite resilient on the international markets, as we shall see later. So moving to the Georgian market itself, Georgian market, the process of slow formalization of Georgian market has been happening starting year 2005, as you can see. The share of household produced wine has been decreasing. It started, and the formal share of the sector started at 28%, and then currently the production of the companies is up to 73%, and as the formalization continues. As for the half year of 2020, the latest available data which we have, the production of formal sector of Georgian wine has not declined by much. It is mere 9%, which gives us a strong idea about the resilience of the Georgian producer market. One additional thing that has to be mentioned in terms of Georgian wine production is that the increase in the production has led to the increase of the stock available for the companies, that you can see on the chart on the right from the purple bars. And this stock, basically, as we shall see later, is 80% of it as of today is meant for export, which gives us great possibilities to try to enter new markets and increase the penetration on the existing markets of export. If we move a little bit further into the production value chain, down the value chain and move to the ertveli itself, which is the process of collecting and processing the grapes, we can see that despite the COVID, year 2020 has been better, although slightly better than year 2019. Basically, the year 2019 was a new record-setting year, so the record currently moved to 2020 with 276,000 tons, of grapes being processed this year. As for the regions where the grape has been harvested, the largest and most important region in this case is Kakheti in Georgia, which is also in line with the vineyard distribution throughout the country. 73% of the vineyard of Georgia is located in this region. The business of making the grapes, which is suitable for the wine production in Georgia, is quite profitable as of now. Here we have the payoffs, the IRRs of various types of grapes, and also the initial investment required for 1 hectare of these grapes. And as we can see, most of the IRRs range from 14% to circa 18%. We have the grape varieties which need smaller initial investments, like this grid you can see on the left. But we have also some species which require more intense initial capital investments. From them, Saperavi and its several subtypes like Kindmaraule and Mukuzani are obvious, Alexandrouli Mujuretuli and Ojareshi Chaveri, although their payoffs also are larger than those of the remaining grapes varieties. So as from these payoffs, we can pretty much conclude that this business remains profitable in Georgia so far. Moving to the dynamics of the formal sector and its turnover currently in Georgia, we can see that, first of all, the number of the companies producing wine has skyrocketed in Georgia throughout the last 10 years. In the December 2009, we had 180 companies producing wine. As of November 2020, we have circa 660 companies producing wine. Out of this, to give you the idea about the market, 30 companies are either big or medium scale. And as for the rest of the market, it remains quite fragmented as of now. The turnover of Georgian companies throughout the period of the pandemics, and we have the official results of this first half of the year, has not declined if we see the total numbers. Although here we talk together about the companies producing spirits and wines, because despite how the company is registered formally, most of spirit producers also produce wine in Georgia, and some of the big wine producers in Georgia also produce spirits. So we have to look at this in the combination. The turnover of wine, it declined by circa 13% throughout the first half year. However, the turnover of the spirits increased, and the result is basically the same, which is not a bad result in terms of the pandemics. If we move to the formal sector, because here we also show the value of the house-made wine and house-made spirits created in the country, then we can see that proportion of exports to the local market in Georgia, it remained circa in the range of 75% to 25% throughout the last years. However, currently the exports, they have been on a rise. The export has risen by 10% in Georgia in the first half year. And here we're talking again jointly about the export of spirits and wine in first half of the year. As for the domestic market, it has decreased by nearly 1/3, which is in line with the situation going on in Georgia. As you all know, we had serious lockdowns during the first stage of the pandemic. And also we had currently we are also having the restrictions associated with eating out, restrictions associated with going to restaurants and consuming wine there, thus has decreased. Also, one another factor contributing to this decrease on the local market is the total absence of tourism in Georgia currently, because as you know, our borders remain so far closed. If we move to the per capita consumption in Georgia, to finish talking about the domestic market, per capita consumption in Georgia has in fact decreased. For the last 15 years, it decreased from 33 liters per one person in Georgia to circa 20 liters. But this is a sign of the changing preferences of Georgian consumer. We have less and less consumed homemade wine in large quantities, as you could see from the chart above depicting the formalization of the sector. Instead, we started consuming wine in restaurants, started drinking bottled wine, and which in fact led to the smaller amount of wine intake. However, it is also in line with the formalization of the sector and the rise in the tastes of Georgian consumers. So far, wine intake in Georgia per capita remains quite high, as you can see. It is higher than in most of the current major trade partners of Georgian wine, but it is also somewhat lower than in other countries, which are potentially good export markets for Georgia. We have analyzed the countries which are probably good countries for further increasing our exports in Georgia via several criteria, and came up with a list of the attractive countries, which you can see on the chart on the right. The criteria were the attractiveness of the market itself, which stemmed from the total size of wine import in these countries, the average prices of wine import in these countries, geographic proximity of those countries, and also existing Georgian exports to those countries, because in the countries where Georgian wine has certain type of reputation built up, we find it is easier to expand and build upon this existing reputation. And the other standpoint was the riskiness of the export market. We evaluated the riskiness of the export markets with credit rating, corruption index, economic freedom index, and so on. And basically, with the whole list of potential export countries, it boiled down to this, which are presented here. As we can see, we then tried to analyze what kind of wines do these countries import currently. These countries import circa $18 billion worth of wine from so-called traditional producers. We call Western Europe traditional producers of the wine. Circa 6 billion in these countries comes from the high-tech producers. These are the new world wines, which are from Latin America, which are from Australia, and so on. Circa $1 billion worth of wine every year is imported in these countries from the niche producers, which are basically countries like us, Eastern European countries, Israel is in here, for instance, and so on. And circa 200 million only comes from Georgia's exports in these countries. So basically, these markets give us limitless options to increase our penetration and increase the exports to these countries. And basically, the right demand exists, we think, to go and expand into these markets further. Now, as for the actual export numbers of Georgia, as you can see, the export itself already in 9 months, and we're already talking only about the wine exports without spirits. The wine exports of Georgia weakened with Russia and China, as we could see from the charts above. China's wine imports currently suffer pretty much due to this pandemic situation. But the good news is that it's strengthened with EU, strengthened with UK, and also the positive dynamics could be observable in the Ukraine. As from the diversification standpoint, which remains one of the key problems with Georgian export, to call it so, currently, circa 80% of current Georgian exports is still very much dependent on region and China. So CIS countries, Russia, Ukraine, and mostly Russia make up a biggest chunk of exports. And this dependency has been growing since year 2013. Prior to this year, we had embargo from Russia, as you can see, and Georgian exports was only to other markets. After this, since the export in Russia resumed, Russia took up the largest chunk of Georgian exports so far. As for the prices of Georgian wine and what happened during the pandemics, we can see that export price is currently coming back after suffering the fall of about 7% during the height of the pandemic in Q2 2020. And in Q3 2020, this average number consists of the numbers from the beginning of the quarter being lower, and September was already circa 0. So we came back to our initial export price as of the last month. However, as for the Georgian domestic market, the prices so far are not very fast to elevate back to their prior numbers. So year on year, we remain at -6% on the domestic market, which is in line with the numbers of the decreasing domestic demand, which we already discussed. As for the average pricing of Georgian wine exports to some of the key countries where it is exported, we can say that Georgian wine is basically priced a bit higher in other exports, which EU and UK does. It is also higher than in CIS. It is a bit lower than average price of Chinese imported wine. And also it is very interesting to see that the prices of average imports to USA are quite higher than of these other countries, because you have to factor in the transportation costs, which are pretty much high from the traditional markets to US. And price for Georgian wine here is on average also higher, however, remains a bit lower than the country's and remains a bit higher than the country's total average. Moving to what kind of wine do our largest trade partners love and import from Georgia. Starting with the brands, these are mostly red wine brands like Kinzmarauli with 22%, Alazani Valley with 18%, Saperavi, all types, they cover 17% of export, and so on. As for the variety of the wine which is being exported from Georgia, our main partners love red semi-sweet Georgian wine. After this comes red dry wine. As you can see with some of the key countries, for instance, in Russia, Kazakhstan, other CIS countries, also in Europe, Georgian red semi-sweet wine is the most popular. The difference comes, for instance, with China, where they prefer red dry Georgian wine. Here, this percentage is the largest. And also, for instance, the situation is a bit different in Poland, where they also like Georgian white wine as compared to the red. Here, one point to be mentioned is that, as we already showed you during the Trelli slide, two grapes varieties hold the biggest chunk of Georgian production. These are Katsiteli and Saperavi. Katsiteli accounts for circa 63% of the production, and it is the it is the white wine, but only 20% of export. While Saperavi accounts for 29% of production, but 65% of export. So there is a mismatch between the production and export types of wine, which is being generally loved by our trade partners. And our long-term view is that the domestic production will more and more switch to accommodate the needs of the largest trade partners. So we shall be more tilted to the production of red varieties of the wine in the future. As for the profitability of Georgian producers, here you can see the survey of 26 largest Georgian companies producing the wine. And the main thing here is that the financials generally of these companies are pretty much healthy. And if you look at the profit margin, which varies between 16 and 17% on average, this is higher, practically higher by the factor of 2 than the whole profit margin of Georgian business sector in the country. So the industry remains pretty much attractive in the country. The main risk associated with the industry so far in the country is a lack of diversification in exports and the high dependency on one single market, Russian market, as we saw for now. That is a reason why the country is constantly striving to enter the new markets and constantly thinking how can Georgian wine be better marketed and be better accommodated at the foreign markets. Basically, with this, the overview comes to an end, the presentation comes to an end, and basically we are open for your questions, obviously.
Okay, first of all, a couple of clarifications. I think it's essential for some of the audience. What you call brands like Kinzmarauli and Alazani Valley, those are more like styles of wines.
Yes,
they are made like they're not producers. So Alazani Valley is a semi-sweet but relatively lower cost with some additives, and Kinzmarauli is more naturally semi-sweet wine. So just for the clarification.
Yes, of course.
But very interesting presentation and lots of data, of course, and we will need some time to digest all of it. By the way, Kim, if you are there and if you have any questions, you can show your face and decide if you want to ask any questions. But but I had one question. You talked about the pricing, export pricing, and I think US. You're absolutely right. US is, in terms of pricing, there is no. You are missing one market which even higher average price. I think it's Japan, although quantities are smaller. But in terms of US, I should tell you that the transportation cost is not a major factor there, because if sometime exporting and shipping wine to some of the Nordic countries and maybe UK may cost you almost as much as in US. The difference is that I think in terms of penetration level of higher quality wines, probably US, particularly restaurant business. I mean, if you take, let's say, DC market, or also some other places, lots of significant fraction of sales is through restaurants where high-end wines are sold. So if you take, let's say, average price bottle, that impacts. Of course, there are some wines that are imported here as well that are relatively low cost. Average price ex work is, let's say, $3 or close to that. But there are lots of wines that are $7, $8, $9, $10, or $12. So that's a difference. So which shows that U.S. market should be target market for U.S. That proves that. And I think we should spend more time on marketing here. That's my sort of conclusion. But Kim, I think Tornike presented some very interesting data, and some of this will be probably in your presentation as well. I don't know if you had the chance to listen to his presentation, but
yes, thank you very much. I did enjoy it greatly, and a lot of those data I have not seen in such detail before. So it was fascinating to see those graphs, and I look forward to seeing them in a file form, because on the screen it was a bit hidden on the right hand side by the images of yourself and so on. But no, it's great. Thank you very much. I look forward to interacting after the meeting.
Great. So Tornike, maybe one other question, maybe this is more like a question. In terms of dynamics of a business case for Georgian wine industry, investments into wine industry, you see let's say recent years, the margins are changing to the better. I have missed that point. Are changing to the better or to the worse, or are they stable?
So basically,
if you think about, let's say, return on investments or some other kind of ratios that you talked about.
So basically, let's divide maybe two periods. First is normalized period, let's call it so. Another maybe the times of pandemics, which is for now. What we saw as the margins, they are normalized period. So they were the full year ending 2019. In the normalized period, the margins are pretty high for the business right now. As for what is happening right now in the times of pandemics, there are certain discounts in the prices. There are certain discounts in the demand, as you could see, which are more coming from the domestic market side. But as the situation normalizes, we are pretty confident that this all will come back. So the wine itself, also the grape making for the wine and harvesting the grape, both remain quite profitable businesses in Georgia, and their profits so far are higher than in many other industries.
Did you do the comparison with other countries as well of this industry, or no?
To say, in fact, no, we haven't looked at the profitability.
I'm wondering what would be the sort of. I mean, as far as I know, there are. I mean, not every country in every country wine business is profitable. So I'm wondering what would be the defining sort of ingredients or drivers of success or profitability of Georgian wine industry. Maybe next year's project.
This is a very interesting point for further analysis. As for the business case, I would more call it the case of exports. because we ourselves are a very small country with a limited base. Here, basically, as you could see, the one source which might bring some additional growing domestic consumption is the fast growth of tourism, for instance. And also the increasing formalization of the sector, which domestically there is also some area which currently is occupied by the homemade wine. As we progress further, it could be more formalized into the wine produced by the companies. But as for the exports, we are quite sure that the options for Georgian wine is limitless. The case of investment in Georgian wine, it stems from advertising the wine more and more to many other countries, and our wine agency is doing a fantastic job in this respect. It is moving Georgia to so basically European countries, to USA, to other countries where the quality and history of Georgian wine will be the main defining factor for it to be bought. So Georgian wine is not only a wine itself, it brings a history of 8,000 years, and it is a very well marketable tool, let's call it so. It is interesting. And many researchers nowadays worldwide, they think that, for instance, they're saying that millennials, for instance, a decisive factor for them could be drinking, apart from drinking something tasteful, could be drinking something interesting. And this is a case for Georgian wine. So diversification is in export and entering more and more new markets. This is an investment case. And the wine, in terms of its quality, in terms of the variety of the tastes it offers, because Georgia harbors hundreds of types and species of grapes from which different sorts of wines could be made, it can serve a good factor as an opening key for other export markets. So export is the business case for Georgian wine, let's call it so. Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's actually first part of this conference was all about the history and, how the story of 8,000 years and discoveries and all this variety of nature in Georgia and biocultural development, and so how this contributes to the interest towards country. And your predecessors, two sommeliers who were speaking before you, the reason why Washington landscape is so interested in Georgia is not only the taste of wine, but also story of wine. So, and the people who make this wine. So connection to stories is very essential marketing tool these days. And that's why more people visiting Georgia and knowing winemakers is important, but also more winemakers visiting Washington and Seattle and New York and Boston and other places is very important as well, to build this connection between. If you notice, the speakers were saying that it's very essential for a sommelier to know who makes wines and for winemaker to know who the sommelier is, who sells the wines. So I think this is but I found your presentation, I knew it will be very interesting for our audience, and I'm glad that we had this chance to have you. I know it's very late in Tbilisi, it's more than midnight, it's like turning 1 a.m. right now, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I thank you very much for your time and contribution. Thanks to Mary for facilitating it. And turn now to our good friend and colleague Kim Anderson from Adelaide. He has like 6 a.m. in the morning or something like that, 6:30. He's in Australia. So Kim is, in my opinion, best wine economist I've known in my life, and he is also somebody who traveled to Georgia, knows Georgia. I think we were together in Georgia first time. It was probably 2006 or 2007, as I recall. So since that, we developed friendship, but we developed also this collaboration, and I'm very happy to see Kim finally joining Reno Forum, because he missed previous two forums, and now he's joining us at least in this format, hopefully next year in person. Kim, so he's a professor at the University of Adelaide and also vice president of American Association of Wine Economists, where I am proud member as well. So I just little advertisement for myself, Kim. So Kim, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mamuka. It's a great pleasure to be able to be at this forum, having missed the previous two, just because my wife had hip operations exactly at that moment, 1 year after another. So I enjoyed that previous presentation very much. That was a lovely coverage of particularly the prospects for exports for Georgia, and those exports, of course, as we just were discussing, depend heavily on the uniqueness of Georgia. So the presentation now is just to look at one aspect of that uniqueness, which is to do with the varietal composition of, let me just get this right. How do we do that? Slideshow, there we go. Okay, so the stimulus for this was that we have just recently published a new version of our book on which wine grape varieties are grown throughout the world, and that edition updates the earlier work, revises it somewhat, and then Mamuka kindly gave me some data that allowed me to look at the most recent mixture of wine grape varieties grown in Georgia. So this database that we now have gives us a chance to look at how Georgia looks in global perspective. So the key points I was going to make are these four, and I'll just go through them in more detail in a moment. The first is that globally, the varietal mix of countries is becoming less diverse. Countries are becoming more like the rest of the world and are becoming more concentrated in their choice of wine grape varieties. In particular, they're becoming more French, that is, adopting the most popular French varieties, and the proportion of red relative to white has been growing substantially. And that, of course, makes Georgia very different, because Georgia is predominantly a white wine producer and certainly has very few French varieties in its vineyards. The third point is that most countries depend on other countries for grape varieties, and only a small number of countries have a high share of their own country varieties in their mix. And of course, in Georgia, the opposite is the case. Virtually all of the grape varieties grown are from Georgia. And finally, we produce an index of internationalization of grapevine varieties to see to what extent those varieties are spread throughout the world. And Georgia, again, is outstanding there relative to the size of its country. So this is the cover of the book. You can freely access it from our website shown there. It's also purchasable from Amazon if you wish. It's an 800-page book, weighs a lot. And if you are looking for the data itself, you can get them freely also from our university website here. So this first point about the wine grape variety mix globally becoming less diverse is somewhat surprising to many people, because they think through wine globalization that consumers have got more varietal choice than they've ever had. And that's true in most countries that have opened up their wine trade over the past 3 decades. But on the supply side, countries are becoming less diverse, in fact, in their choice of varieties that they're growing. And one way to look at that is to look at what share the top 10 varieties have in each country's vineyard bearing area. And in 2000, they made up about 36% of the world's wine grape bearing area, but by 2016 that had risen 6 percentage points. So you can see that here, if you look vertically above the variety 10 here, it's jumped from 36 to 40, whatever it was there. Or you could look horizontally and say in 2000, half the wine grape area was planted to 21 varieties, and now it's planted to 16 varieties. So there's definitely this increased concentration going on. If we look at it from each country's point of view, we can see how important those first 10 varieties are in each country. It's very high, you can see, for most of those countries. Georgia is one of the highest, with about a bit over 90% of the wine grape area covered by the first 10 varieties. I should mention, as mentioned at the top here, that the Georgian varietal mix data that we had for the book were 2004, and we just altered the hectarage to make that varietal mix match the hectarage in 2016. But most recently I've seen these data for 2019. They're not perfect data for Georgia, but they gave me a sense of how things have are at the moment. And so the data in this and subsequent slides are for these 2 years for Georgia. If we look at those mixes, we developed an index called an index of similarity, which is a bit like a correlation coefficient in that it ranges from 0 to 1. And if a country has an index of 1, it means its varietal mix, that is the share of each of the different varieties in its vineyards, is identical to the average for the world as a whole. And the closer that number is to 0, that index number is to 0, the more dissimilar that country's varietal mix is relative to the global mix. Well, it turns out that all but a dozen countries have become more similar to the global mix this century so far, but that Georgia remains the least similar. And you can see that here. Georgia's on the very right of this, this axis, whereas France is number 1, and that's that index for France has gone up, which means other countries have become more similar to France over this 16-year period. And that includes especially the countries that are able to flexibly alter their vineyard varietal mixes, that is the New World countries. So that's a change. There's very few blue lines here that are above the red lines, which means most countries have become more similar to the rest of the world. But Georgia's gone the opposite way. It's become less similar. It hasn't changed its mix at a time when other countries have changed their mix to become more like France. Looking at those varieties themselves, most national varietal mixes are becoming more dominated by the major French varieties. And this has been mostly at the expense of Italian varieties, although in Australia's case also Spanish varieties, particularly Garnacha or Grenache. So you can see here that the blue down the bottom is France. This is the global vineyard bearing area by varietal country of origin. We do have data that go back to 1990 when France had about 20% of the varieties in the world. Now it has about 40%. So a definite big swing there towards France. Sorry, it's at the expense of Spain, not Italy, the same as it is for Australia. So Spain is the one that has shrunk. Italy has remained similar. It turns out Italian grapes are not very commonly grown in the rest of the world, unlike Spanish and French varieties. So in addition to this swing towards French varieties globally, there's also been a swing towards red varieties. And the red share has risen from 46 to 57% over this period since the turn of the century. That raises interesting questions about why that is the case, and certainly one of the reasons has been the recent growth in imports by China, and China's imports are predominantly red. About close to 90% of their imports are red variety wines. And this is a big contrast to Georgia, which has only about 1% French varieties and less than 20% red in its total wine vineyards. This is the picture of what's happened since 1990, this growth in reds at the expense of whites, a little bit of growth of what are called grey, that is things like Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. But in Georgia, red is still very small, although it's certainly grown a lot since the 1980s and is now close to 20% according to the data that I was given for 2019. Oops, sorry. So these are those data for 2019 that I was given. What they consist of are the survey data, relatively new survey data for Kakheti. And these two varieties dominate, of course, but the data are not available in hectareage form for the rest of the country as far as I understand. But in the 2014 census, there were counts of the number of vines by variety in each region. And so by looking at the varietal mix, by counting up the number of vines in the rest of the world and having an estimate for the relative importance of Kakheti, around 70% of the total, we were able to get a weighted average for Georgia as a whole. And so these are the data that I'm using for Georgia. Just looking at the previous presentation in terms of production, I think these were higher numbers in total production of Georgia. I wasn't sure whether that was production of what was marketed or whether it included also home consumption of by small winemakers.
Yeah, one detail here, Kim, is that sometimes this production level of, let's say, Katsiteli per hectare is higher than, let's say, per Sapirali. So that was make, and he was counting the production, 63% of production was Katsiteli.
Exactly, thank you. Yes, I suspect that that's the issue. And that does raise an interesting question for this type of comparison as to whether one should look at production volumes or acreage. And in our book, we've based it on acreage, but that is obviously another alternative way of doing it, and that's a useful thing to do. Similarly, it's useful to do in looking across regions, because some regions are much higher than other regions. For example, if they have irrigation in some regions but not others, of course, you'll get a higher yield.
And also the age of the vineyards also make difference.
Exactly. Yes. That's very important in expanding countries like New Zealand, for example, that expanded from nothing to very large acreages in a short period. A lot of those young vines have zero or small volumes of production. So there's lots of things you can do in playing with this, but at least this is a quick overview, and by exposing these numbers, hopefully we'll get some feedback as to how we might do this better in the future. The share of own native varieties in each country's vineyard is something else we were able to look at, and Georgia, along with Cyprus and Spain and Greece, have by far the largest share of their own native varieties in their vineyards, and again, this can be a point of marketing advantage for Georgia. So it's number 2 in the list here. Cyprus has almost no foreign varieties, at least from the limited data we have for that country, and Spain and Greece also have a very high proportion of their own varieties in their total vineyards. But for the majority of countries, there's a few here that are a bit less than 10%, and all the other countries are less than 5%. So it's only this dozen or so countries here that have more than half of their vineyard in their native varieties. So Georgia certainly is outstanding in that respect. They're also among the most internationalized varieties in the world. If you look at it relative to the nation's share of global vineyard area. So of course, Georgia is a very small share of the global wine grape area. And if we normalize by that, so divide that native share abroad by this nation share, we get the following graph, where Georgia is again outstanding in terms of the internationalization of its varieties. You might be surprised by that because you know where those varieties are being grown, and it's basically in the neighborhood of Georgia, former Soviet republics and so on. But
Bulgaria, Macedonia. Bulgaria and Macedonia grow Kordzaia.
Yes, Macedonia we didn't have data for here. So for Georgia, it's again, if we look at this index of similarity, you can see these are the countries that are similar in their varietal mix to Georgia. So that's not surprising that they would be grown in countries where Georgia exports to. They are the varieties that consumers in these countries have become familiar with and enjoy. So just to conclude, so that we've got time for discussion, it's clear that Georgia does remain very distinctive in this particular way of its varietal mix as compared with other countries. It is just one of the many marketing advantages Georgia has as it looks to expand its exports, not only in volume terms, but also in unit value terms and to a broader range of markets, particularly in the West. And this particular form of distinction of Georgia is something that's increasing over time as other countries become more similar, become more French, get a bigger share of reds. Georgia is doing neither of those things, or it's getting a bigger share of reds, but from a small base. And so it is becoming, in effect, more distinct than it has been in the past. So let me open it up to questions, Mamuka, rather than chatting on myself.
Thank you, Kim. Great presentation, very interesting one. If Tornike is still there was a question for Tornike that he may be able to answer. I don't know if he's still there or not, but it was about production and export of certified biological, organic or whatever the certified in that terms, sort of bio or organic vineyards, if there is any data on that, but Tornike may not be there anymore. So okay, one big sort of picture item here is that European grape varietals are obviously dominant around the world, and you mentioned some of the new countries like New Zealand, new countries in terms of wine production, as well as Australia. So what do you see there? By the way, today it was mentioned as well that Saperawi now is moving to Australia as well. I don't know if you heard about that, but in general, what do you see in your part of the world? So it's totally, the French dominant varietal. So what is happening there, and what do you see there in terms of interest or Georgian grapes, if any?
Yeah. Well, I think there are differences across the New World countries. New Zealand is very unique as well. It has all the same sorts of things of Georgia, beautiful mountains and scenery and so on to show in photographs. It has a very clean green image in its production. But it's also unique in having just two varieties that dominate. In fact, one variety that dominates, which is Sauvignon Blanc, and the second one is Pinot Noir, grown down in the south of the country. And it has been highly successful in terms of export growth, with that very strong concentration in just those two varieties. Mostly most their exports are mostly dominated by Sauvignon Blanc, and their average price of exports is one of the highest in the world. If you just look at still wine, I think it's higher than France. So it is the highest in the world for still wines. So it's an unusual country that has shown that a small country can become a very big exporter relatively quickly by doing its marketing correctly and showing what's distinctive about those particular wines. Australia is much more widespread in its coverage and certainly has a French dominance now. It was predominantly Spanish dominated in the days of growing for fortified wines. Now, of course, it's almost all for
which
still
grapes?
wines.
Which grapes?
Well, Ganache and so on was a
Grenache,
dominant Spanish variety used for producing port. So they are all different. I think, as you know, Argentina has concentrated on Malbec and done very well with that. So I think there's no reason why Georgia shouldn't do very well with its two key varieties, especially Saperavi, given the growing interest in reds around the world. Australia, as you said, has been growing Saperavi. In fact, I know several of the major Saperavi producers. They're quite close to my home here. And one of them had produced the Saperavi in the first Georgian competition for the world's best non-Georgian Saperavi, and they won that competition.
Yeah, I think our friend Lado Uzunashvili is a winemaker for that.
Yes,
had something to do with it.
And they've done very well selling that wine for about 15 Australian, not much more than $10 a bottle in Australia. So it's a very good wine, very good value, and that's a great way of trying to promote Georgian varieties in Australia. 10 years ago, I asked one of the main importers in Australia, would they import Georgian wine? They said, no way, nobody knows anything about them. Now they are importing them. So as in the US, this is changing quite rapidly.
Demonstrates the progress. So there are two questions that are similar. One is that, so if French varietals are becoming more popular, does that mean Georgian wineries would be more successful exporting if they produce more French wines? And similar question, do you think that the internationalization of the Georgian grape varieties could ultimately boost the sales of Georgian wines? Or would is considered more competition for Georgian wine? So what do you, how can you respond to that?
Two complementary questions. So it requires us to actually analyze why we've had this trend towards more French varieties, and various hypotheses could be put up, and there's no doubt a number of reasons, not just one reason. But one of them could be simply because they're French and everybody likes to think that France is the top of the world's ladder in terms of quality and so on. And certainly in Northeast Asia, that's been the issue. So Australia has had to compete with French wines in China and Japan, for example, where that reputation of France is so strong. So you might imagine some people are saying, well, it's just easier to market these major French varieties than it is to market other ones. So that's one possible explanation. As for selling this, if that was a major explanation, then I suppose one strategy for Georgia is to blend varieties, to have a Cabernet Saperavi blend, for example, and when it's on the shelf in a country that hasn't seen many Georgian wines and they see the word Cabernet first, they think, oh, well, I know that, let me try it, and then they might be able to be weaned onto Saperavi on its own. So there are other reasons. Possibly it's viticulturally, it's that these varieties can be grown over a wider range of terroirs, climate and soils and so on. And that may be part of the explanation as well. So it's something we've still got to do some research on.
Yeah, I have a friend, I won't name his name, otherwise he may be killed in Georgia. So, but he says that there's no way Georgian wines could sell at a very high price unless we start planting French varietals. I disagree with him, but his point is that even looking at Italy, highest priced Tuscany wines, let's say, are not Sangioveses, but are Sassacayas made out of Cabernet or something like that. So, but I think there is a different trend on market, and we have not talked about that much today. But in a sense, Georgia is establishing another category of the wine on the market, which is the so-called amber wine, which is skin contact whites. And if we are successful in establishing that category, like it's rosé, so there's white, there's red, there's rosé, there's like something else, but now there's amber wine. If we manage to do that, and that's one of the sort of big tasks that we all have here, then Georgia will be definitely one of the leaders in that category, and that would allow Georgia to sell its own grape varietals in that category, in the niche category, at relatively higher prices. There are some Georgian wines that are already on the market at averaging at $30, $35 on shelf. So here in Washington and some other places in some of our audience members are selling them pretty successfully. So I think there is a potential, but this is an important intellectual question as well, I guess, which varietals to promote. As a patriot of Georgia, I want to sell more Georgian wines, but I'm Georgian grapes. But this
Well,
may be business-wise different. Yeah.
I think the trend toward amber wines is a great example of how fashions change over time, and if you can catch those easily, then it's a great thing. And in the case of Georgia, into that particular niche, it doesn't have to do anything to change what it's doing now. And so that's a great opportunity where it can sell a larger proportion of its white wines as amber wines using the current forms of production. And to get those higher prices, maybe you will be using Cuivre and using that in the marketing as well. Those sorts of prices you mentioned, the $35 a bottle, is not out of the question for many people who look for something different. And we've seen that with Chinese wines that are now becoming, some are becoming exported, and they're certainly in that sort of price range, showing that a new country can get into international markets at those price levels with something, a point of difference. And as you mentioned in the previous session, the story that goes behind that, selling that story as well.
Sorry, one other question is not related necessarily to this presentation today, but you wrote an excellent book on globalization and wine industry. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you're supposed to speak, I think, a couple of years ago about that, and we didn't talk much about. And so we had some hints on some of the data that you provided, but I just wanted to use this opportunity to advertise a little bit of your work that you've done on excellent work, by the way.
Well, thank you. That book is available from Cambridge University Press. In fact, it's currently being translated into Chinese as well, and they'll be selling it in China next year. We have the database for that is also freely available on our website, and we've just recently updated it, so we can look more at more recent data as well now. But those data go back to 1860 when we, for the world as a whole, back earlier for some countries. And so we tried to look at what happened in the first globalization wave in the latter part of the 19th century and contrast that with what's happened in the world in the last 30 years. And this past 30 years, it's a very, very different story. There was relatively little globalization back in the 19th century of wine. That is, it still remained very much a product that was both produced and consumed in mostly Western Europe. Whereas since the 90s, it has become a vastly different situation, and the share of production that is exported, that is the consumption that is going as is a foreign product, has risen from around 10% to around 40% today. So that's why the consumers have never had it so good in terms of the range of styles and varieties and sources of origin of wines that are there. And that makes it so much easier for a country like Georgia to break into these new markets, because these new markets are used to now receiving wines from foreign countries much more than they used to be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of, entry to US market, let's say, which I know relatively better than other places, it's definitely much easier than I can imagine what it was like 50 or 60 years ago or 100 years ago, no doubt about that. So, yes. but I just wanted you to mention that data from 1860 to, it was 2016 or 17 when it was published.
Yes,
right?
now it's up to 2018. Yep.
Yeah, it's an incredible resource for everybody who is interested in wine production in different parts of the world and so forth. There's a little question here. I don't know if you can answer this question, but Kordzaia is Georgia's most planted grape. Is this grape catching on globally? You said a little bit about that, but do you have any data on how much is? I think you said something about that.
Yes, it's certainly this, the most important, along with Saperavi, for Georgia in international reputation. My feeling is it's probably not considered as sufficient as a high quality as Saperavi in foreign markets, but that's just hearsay. It's there's no reason why it shouldn't become more important. I think through this amber wine niche is probably the most obvious way to increase its popularity.
I think Katsatelli's quality is underappreciated because it was always considered to be the volume grape. Because it was produced, it can produce large volumes, but doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot produce good wines out of that grape. By the way, in a previous session, in the first session in the morning, last speaker actually shown data that in 90s, Katsatelli was one of the widely planted grape varietal because of Ukraine and Russia and Bulgaria and Romania and Moldova and other places. We are planting it a lot. So it's pretty, and in the US, Finger Lake area has about 12 wineries that produces Katsatelli, as well as several small wineries in Virginia. So it's adaptable to different natural environments. So that allows, that's why it's spreading relatively easier than some other grapes. And also it has a larger yield. If you let it grow in terms of yield, and then quality probably goes down. But if you manage it properly, then you have a right amount on the right sort of size of trees and so forth. Then it can be incredible wine. And we've had some of this, some of the best Georgian winemakers producing excellent wine from Katsatelli. So just wanted to.
I think a good example of another country that has taken advantage of that is Austria. Since its disastrous scandal back in 1985 and its export market collapsed, it's since grown. But in the most recent decade, it's grown in value terms, not in volume terms. And they have just raised the quality by reducing yields and so on. And so that is definitely a strategy that can be used. It doesn't require more vineyards to be planted. It just requires them to be managed in a different way.
But it's also interesting that data shows that acreage, as you call it, so the hectareage, planted size of area of different grapes in Georgia is growing exponentially. And because finally in about 2007, 8, during this embargo time, people realized, the Russian embargo time, people realized that they needed different type of vineyards, more modern vineyards, planted in more modern way, with a most kind of scientific approach and so forth. And there was a decade of planting new vineyards, and they are just starting to produce now. And this is a very interesting process that is happening. It's a renewal of Georgian vineyard sort of inventory, let's put it this way, or stock. So I think for in the next several years, we'll have more and more. Every year production is growing because of that the more vineyards are getting more production, but also quality of grapes that are produced is growing as well. So which is absolutely essential for high quality wines, particularly whites. But frankly, since we are talking about Katsatelli, it's not the Katsatelli that people are planting. There are some Katsatellis as well, but there are lots of relatively more forgotten varietals like Kisi. I grew up in Georgia in wine country. I spent lots of time with wine my entire life, and I've learned about Kisi like 15, 18 years ago, not before that. So because there was nobody who would produce wine from Kisi. So now Kisi is one of the major grape varietals, very popular, very intense, very interesting, very aromatic. So very interesting stuff. And there are tens of grapes like that. So that's natural sort of process that more and more relatively well-forgotten new grape varietals are planted. So, and by the way, Erica, our friend from Boston, reminds us that Konstantin Frank in Finger Lake makes Katsatelli as an amber wine as well now. So that's also helps the establishment of the new category, amber wine. In the US market. Kim, is there anything you want to tell us? I think I know that it's a little early than I plan to finish it, but I don't see any questions from the audience, and we had the entire day of conversations today, and the audience may be a little tired as well. So, and you have a long day to go today. But if you have some things to say, some final words of wisdom, please share.
No, I just wish you well in the industry there to continue to sell the good story of what Georgian wines have to offer the world. The increasing diversity of plantings of wines that are being marketed now that you mentioned just a minute ago is something that will certainly help that process. And as you say, if these varieties like Kordzaia, which you gave me a sample of last time we were together, if they become more popular, then Finger Lakes and other regions in the world might start planting them as well, and that helps to spread the word about Georgian varieties, even if initially they're domestic production. So that is being provided in, for example, the US. But I think the future is fantastically bright for Georgia, and I wish you well as it progresses.
This is real words of wisdom. We all believe in your words. Future is fantastic for Georgia and Georgian wine industry. And with that, I will probably, it looks like, so I will finish, I will end this third Winner Forum of America Science and Practice of Wine section of it, which was designed for today. There will be wine tasting on 19th of November for trade and industry people and wine journalists and so forth. And hopefully that will be successful as well. We had an intense and interesting day of, we learned a lot, all of us who were here. We had actually thousands of people watching us in different times on Facebook as well. So it was widely broadcasted. And this will remain as a resource on our website, these presentations. We'll try to post both videos of the presentations as well as slides. I think it should be helpful to our audience. And hopefully, Kim, next year we all get together in UC Davis and do the in-person fourth Winner Forum of America. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks to all our speakers, other speakers, and thanks to Irina Satyani, who is behind this Winner Forum sign, helping us in this organization of this conference. And thanks to all of the participants and whoever was staying with us for the entire day today. So thanks, Kim. Thanks to audience.
Thank you so much.
So long.
Bye.
So long.